The sun dipped low behind the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, casting a fiery orange glow over the tiny frontier town nestled in the valley below. Its rugged wooden buildings stood in silent defiance of the wilderness that surrounded it. It was the kind of place that seemed destined to exist only at the edges of history, a small, hard-won settlement on the cusp of the unknown. People came here to escape the laws and luxuries of the civilized world, seeking freedom in a land that neither knew nor cared for the concept. Emily, the young wife of a hard-working settler, stood at the edge of their small cabin, gazing out across the barren landscape. Her hands rested on her swollen belly, feeling the life growing within her, kicking softly in the quiet of the late afternoon. It had been a long, exhausting pregnancy, but she could feel the promise of the future in every movement. Her husband, John, worked in the fields, tending to the crops that would see them through the winter. Together, they had built a life here, a life that had never been easy, but one that was theirs. They had struggled for every inch of land, every wall built, every meal eaten, and every night they spent under the vast, unbroken sky. But as the light of the day began to fade, the serenity of the moment shattered. A sound, a high-pitched scream carried by the wind. Emily's heart leaped into her throat as she turned, instinctively looking for John. She didn't see him, but before she could make sense of the noise, the sound of hooves thundered in the distance. A moment later, the first arrow sliced through the air, burying itself into the wood of their cabin, mere inches from her. Chaos erupted. Shouts filled the air, followed by the sounds of horses galloping and the unmistakable war cries of a band of Native Americans. It wasn't just an attack, it was an invasion. They had come with fury in their eyes, driven by a thirst for retribution for perceived wrongs. The settlers in the valley had been unaware, too naive, too trusting of the land around them. They hadn't realized that the resentment had been building for months, that it had come to a head in the violence that would befall them now. Emily's breath caught in her chest as she turned to run toward the house to find John, but she didn't get far. Strong hands grabbed her from behind, spinning her around. She gasped, heart hammering in her chest, as the broad face of a man, one of the raiders, loomed over her. His skin was weathered, his eyes cold and unyielding. Before she could even scream, he clamped a rough hand over her mouth, dragging her away from the cabin. "Not a sound," he growled in a language she didn't understand. She kicked and thrashed in his grip, fear rising like bile in her throat, her vision blurred with tears as she fought to break free. But there were others, more raiders, surrounding the small settlement. They were moving swiftly, methodically, tearing through the houses, setting fire to the homes, taking what they could. Emily could hear the desperate cries of the other women, the panicked shouts of children. The raid was swift, brutal, and utterly unforgiving. She was too weak to fight back, too frightened. The man's grip on her tightened, and before she could understand what was happening, she was lifted onto the back of a horse, forced into a rough, unfamiliar saddle. Through her tear-filled eyes, she caught a glimpse of John, standing helplessly at the edge of the yard, his rifle in hand, but frozen, unable to act. His gaze locked with hers, filled with panic and guilt, and in that moment, Emily felt her heart shatter. The man with the rough hand spurred the horse forward, pulling her away from the one person she loved more than anything. Her thoughts raced, her pulse quickened. But there was nothing she could do. The world around her dissolved as she was carried further into the darkness, into the unknown, her only thoughts for the child within her, for her husband, who could not save her. The town was burning behind her. As the raiders rode off, Emily's body ached with every movement. Her wrists were bound tightly, the ropes cutting into her skin. She couldn't see much through the darkness, only the flashes of fire that illuminated the night sky. She heard the harsh voices of the men around her, laughing and speaking in their own language, foreign and incomprehensible. She didn't know where they were taking her, but she knew it wasn't good. The fear gnawed at her like a constant, insistent pain. Behind her, John's voice carried over the wind, distant and desperate. "Emily!" His cry was a plea, a cry that would haunt her forever. She wanted to scream back to him, to tell him she was still alive, but she couldn't. She didn't have the strength, and even if she did, what good would it do? She had seen the cruelty in their eyes. She knew that there was no saving her, no escape from the nightmare that had descended upon them. As the hours passed, Emily's world narrowed. The only thing she could focus on was her breathing, each breath shallow and strained. She tried to keep her thoughts clear, tried to hold on to the memories of her life before the raid. She thought of John, of their love, of their future together. But it felt like the more she held on to those memories, the further they slipped away from her grasp. And then, a shift in the night. The sounds of the raiders grew quieter, the thudding of horses' hooves slowing. Emily raised her head weakly, eyes searching for any sign of hope. But there was none. The wilderness stretched out before her, endless and empty, and she realized with a sinking feeling that this was no longer about her survival. It was about something far more terrifying. She was a pawn in a game that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with something much larger than her. As they continued on, Emily's body ached with exhaustion. Her mind swirled in a haze of fear and confusion. She felt the weight of the life growing inside her, the burden of the future, and she wished desperately that she could somehow keep this child safe. But how could she? How could she protect a child when her very survival was in question? The world had already been taken from her. Hours stretched into an eternity as the raiders moved deeper into the wilderness, into lands unknown. The night seemed endless. The stars above were too distant, too far out of reach. Emily's mind grew heavy with fatigue, but her fear never ceased. In the darkness, she knew that everything she had ever known, everything she had ever loved, was slipping away. And still, her husband's cry echoed in her ears, but rescue was not coming, not yet. And in the distance, a lone figure watched from the shadows. He had seen the raiders' movement, he had seen the woman taken, and his decision was made. The cowboy, hardened by years of solitude, battle, and loss, would not let this woman fall into the hands of these men, not while he had breath in his body. His course was set. There would be no turning back. The fate of this woman and the child growing within her would be in his hands. The winds howled across the open plains, but nothing was as loud as the gunfire that would soon follow. The cowboy's journey had begun. And with it, so too would the struggle for survival, for honor, and for something deeper than any of them could yet understand. The wind cut through the mountains like a knife, the air crisp and biting, carrying with it the smell of the distant forests and the promise of rain. The cowboy pushed forward, his face set in grim determination as he moved deeper into the wilderness, the weight of his decision pressing on his shoulders. Each step took him farther from the comfort of civilization, away from the familiar scent of earth and sweat, and into the unknown. His name was Jacob, but most people had long since forgotten it. He was a man of few words and even fewer friends, having learned long ago that the world offered little more than pain, loss, and the relentless march of time. His past was filled with the scars of war, of family lost, and of a life that had slowly been whittled away by grief and regret. Now, the only thing that seemed to keep him going was the bitter need to survive. Survival. It had become his singular focus after the death of his wife and child. 2 lives lost in a senseless battle he had never asked for. He had wandered, aimlessly at first, until the land had taken him in, shaping him into the man he was now, the man who had just decided to risk everything for a woman he had never met. The wind howled again, sending a chill through his bones as he glanced over his shoulder. He hadn't seen another soul for days, and yet the uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach refused to dissipate. It was the same feeling that had driven him to act when he heard the news of the raid. A woman taken, a pregnant woman no less. His instincts had kicked in then, the same instincts that had once guided him through battles, through the wilderness, through the darkest moments of his life. But this wasn't about war or personal gain. This was about something deeper, a man's honor, a sense of duty. Jacob was no hero. He was a man who had been tested by time and hardship, a man who had learned to fight for what mattered, even when it seemed like everything was lost. And as he moved through the wilderness, he thought of the woman he was going to save, Emily. She had no idea who he was, what he had sacrificed to come this far, but in some strange way that didn't matter. The fact that she was a woman, vulnerable, pregnant, alone, mattered more. For hours, Jacob pressed on, his boots crunching against the dry earth, his hand resting lightly on the handle of his rifle. His mind kept drifting back to the faces of those raiders, their dark, calculating eyes, the way they had taken Emily with such brutal ease. He could still hear her scream echoing in his ears, and it pushed him forward with a relentlessness that only grew stronger with each passing hour. The landscape seemed endless, and the journey was taking a toll on him. His body was beginning to ache, the fatigue creeping up on him like the steady drumbeat of a distant war. He stopped for a moment, kneeling by a small stream to drink from the cold, clear water. His reflection stared back at him, hardened, weathered, a man who had lived through too much. He could feel the weight of his past settling around him, the decisions he had made, the ones that had led him here. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't asked to be the one who had to do the right thing, but here he was. As he filled his canteen, a rustle in the brush caught his attention. His hand instinctively went to his rifle, his senses sharpening. But it was only a deer, quick, silent, and cautious, darting across his path. It was a reminder of the unforgiving nature of the world he was in. There was no room for softness here. Survival demanded strength, and strength was something he had learned to rely on. He continued on, moving as quietly as he could through the dense trees, the shadows growing longer as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The temperature dropped quickly, and Jacob's breath came out in sharp clouds as he pressed forward, not willing to stop until he had found her. The silence of the wilderness pressed in around him, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of an animal. His mind was filled with the image of Emily, her wide, frightened eyes, her body trembling as she was carried away. It was a haunting image, one that refused to leave him. And then, just as he was beginning to think that he might never find her, something shifted in the air. It was subtle at first, an almost imperceptible change in the wind, the scent of something familiar. His instincts told him to stop, to listen, and so he did. The sounds of the night seemed to fade away, and for a moment all he could hear was the beating of his own heart. And then, like a whisper in the darkness, he heard it. A low, steady rhythm, the sound of horses' hooves, growing louder with each passing second. He didn't need to think twice. He moved swiftly, dropping to his knees, his body blending into the shadows. There they were. A small group of raiders, moving slowly, cautiously, just ahead. He counted them. 4, maybe 5. They were on horseback, their eyes scanning the land, their voices low but urgent. They weren't far from him, but more importantly, he could see her. Emily. She was on horseback as well, her hands bound, her face pale and drawn. She looked exhausted, fragile, like a woman who had been through more than her share of torment. Jacob's heart clenched at the sight. He had to act. He couldn't wait any longer. He knew this was his only chance. For a moment he hesitated, studying the raiders. They weren't paying much attention, their focus on the road ahead, their conversation quiet but tense. It was clear they were on edge, perhaps worried about being followed. His fingers tightened around the rifle, the cold metal biting into his palm. He knew that the first shot would be the most crucial. One mistake, and everything could go wrong. But Jacob wasn't the kind of man to make mistakes. Not anymore. The wind shifted again, this time carrying with it the faintest scent of smoke. Something burning, something alive. Jacob knew the raiders were close to their camp, but he also knew they would be too focused on their prey to notice anything out of place. He could strike now, take them out one by one, or he could wait for the perfect moment. His instincts screamed at him to move, to act now before it was too late. And so, with a single, fluid motion, Jacob stood, his rifle coming up with deadly precision. He squeezed the trigger. The first raider dropped before he even knew what hit him. The others reacted in a blur of movement, scrambling for their weapons, but Jacob was already in motion. He moved like a shadow, his rifle steady, his eyes focused on the next target. The second shot rang out, and another raider fell. The others scattered, but Jacob was faster. He wasn't going to let them escape. Not now. Emily screamed, but it was drowned out by the roar of gunfire and the chaos of the moment. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest as he moved toward her, his rifle still raised. She was struggling against her bonds, her body shaking with fear, but when she saw him, her eyes widened. She didn't know who he was, but in that moment, he was her only hope. Jacob reached her, his hand cutting through the ropes that bound her. She fell into his arms, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, but Jacob didn't look back. He had done what he came to do. But the danger wasn't over. He had just bought them time, and the real test was about to begin. The wind howled as the last of the raiders regrouped, and Jacob knew that the night was far from finished. The stakes had only gotten higher, and now he was in this for something bigger than survival, for Emily, for the child inside her, and for whatever honor remained in the man he had once been. The night was closing in, and the world felt as if it had become a battleground. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and gunpowder, the distant cries of the raiders echoing across the wilderness. Jacob moved quickly, dragging Emily to the safety of the trees, pulling her deeper into the shadows. Her body was trembling in his arms, and for a moment he felt a pang of guilt for not getting her to safety sooner. The fear in her eyes, the desperate way she clung to him, was a constant reminder of the stakes. He couldn't fail her now. They had no time to rest. The raiders were regrouping, and they wouldn't be far behind. Jacob had taken out 2 of them, but there were more, at least 3, maybe 4 still out there. He had to think fast. He could feel Emily's breath against his neck, shallow and quick, as if she was struggling to keep up with him. He knew she wasn't physically capable of running far, especially in her condition, and that weighed heavily on him. "Stay quiet," Jacob whispered, his voice low but firm. Emily nodded, her face pale in the moonlight. She was exhausted, terrified, but there was something in her eyes now, something that told Jacob she had resigned herself to whatever would come next. She wasn't fighting him anymore. She wasn't fighting at all. Jacob's eyes scanned the surrounding landscape. The raiders were no longer in sight, but they wouldn't stop searching for long. They would track them down. They always did. He had seen enough to know how these kinds of people operated. They didn't leave witnesses. They didn't spare anyone. His hand went instinctively to the knife at his belt. It was a good blade, sharp, worn down by use but dependable. He could use it to cut the last of the raiders down if it came to that. But Jacob was no fool. He didn't trust in luck. He had been in enough skirmishes to know that one wrong move could end it all. If they were to survive this, he would need to outthink them, outmaneuver them. Emily was too weak to keep running, too exhausted to fight. Jacob could feel her shivering in his arms, but her mind was still sharp. She might not have known how to handle a rifle, but she understood survival in the wilderness. She had the resolve of a woman who had already faced too much. "Where are they?" Emily whispered, her voice strained but clear. Jacob could hear the fear beneath it, the fear for herself, for her child. "I don't know," Jacob said, though in truth he could guess. "But they won't stop." Emily nodded. She didn't speak again, and Jacob was grateful for it. There was no need for words. He could feel the weight of everything, the lives they were about to lose, the ones they were fighting to protect. He pulled her deeper into the trees, away from the clearing where they had been. The ground beneath them was soft, wet from an earlier rain, making it difficult to move quietly. Jacob knew they couldn't stay here for long. If the raiders had already begun to fan out, they could easily track them. They needed to move fast, and they needed cover. Ahead of them was a ridge, low and flat, with a small cluster of rocks to the left. Jacob could make out the faintest glimmer of light in the distance, just enough to suggest a campfire. The raiders had found a temporary shelter, likely where they were regrouping. Jacob was willing to bet it was their last mistake. He turned to Emily. "We're going to make a break for the rocks," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "When I say go, we move fast." She didn't respond, but Jacob felt the slight pressure of her hand in his. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to reassure him that she wasn't giving up. Not yet. Jacob let go of her hand for a moment, drawing his rifle from its sling. He checked it, loaded, cocked, ready. He wasn't sure how many raiders were out there, but he had enough ammunition to make it count, enough to do what needed to be done. His heart was pounding, and the adrenaline was rushing through his veins, heightening his senses. He was calm on the outside, but inside the pressure was mounting. He motioned for Emily to crouch down. He moved in front of her, watching the trees for movement. Silence descended upon them, broken only by the sound of distant rustling. Jacob's eyes narrowed. He could feel them getting closer. He could hear their voices, faint but unmistakable. They were close. Too close. And then, from the shadows, the first raider appeared. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his movements slow as he stalked the underbrush, eyes scanning the ground. He hadn't seen them yet, but Jacob could see everything. The way his rifle hung loosely across his back, the knife at his belt, the careless arrogance in his stride. This man wasn't paying attention. He was too confident. He didn't expect anyone to be close. Jacob didn't hesitate. He lifted his rifle, took a deep breath, and fired. The shot rang out in the stillness of the night, sharp and clean. The raider collapsed instantly, his body crumpling to the ground without a sound. The second shot came almost immediately after, taking down another raider who had been positioned to his left. Both men were dead before they even realized what hit them. Emily gasped softly, her hand clenching around Jacob's arm, but she didn't speak. She understood the gravity of the moment. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating, but Jacob wasn't done yet. A third raider emerged, this one more cautious, his eyes darting back and forth. He didn't see the bodies of his comrades yet, and he was looking for the source of the noise. Jacob could see him scanning the trees, his hand gripping the rifle at his side. He was nervous, but he was still a threat. Jacob didn't wait. He moved swiftly, the shadows his ally. He slipped through the trees, approaching the raider. From behind. The man turned just as Jacob lunged, his knife flashing in the moonlight. The raider's scream was muffled by the sudden stab of the blade. Jacob's hand twisted, and the man's body went limp in his arms. 3 down. Jacob muttered under his breath, his heart racing as the adrenaline surged through him. But there was no time to rest. The last raider was ahead, and he wasn't going to be caught unaware. Jacob knew that the remaining man was close, perhaps already on his way to investigate. There was no doubt in his mind that the man would come charging, but Jacob had one advantage. He had the high ground. He turned to Emily, who was clinging to a nearby rock, her eyes wide with fear. Her face was pale, sweat beading on her forehead. She didn't speak, didn't ask him to stop. She understood. There was no turning back now. Jacob moved toward the ridge, climbing quickly, silently. His heart was pounding as he neared the top. He knew the last raider was moments away, but he was ready. He had made his choice, and there was no going back. The raider appeared, just as Jacob had anticipated. He was moving quickly, his eyes wide with fear, no longer confident. He had seen his comrades fall, and he was hunting for the source of the threat. Jacob took a deep breath, leveled his rifle, and aimed. The raider never knew what hit him. A single shot rang out, and the final man fell, crumpling to the ground with a soft thud. Jacob stood over him, his chest heaving as he surveyed the aftermath. There was silence now. The threat was gone, but Emily's survival was far from assured. She was still fragile, still caught in the grip of fear and exhaustion. Jacob made his way back to her, his legs shaky with relief. He reached out and helped her up, his grip firm but gentle. "We're not out of this yet," he said, his voice low but filled with an urgency that wouldn't be ignored. "Red. We need to move." And they did. The night was not yet over, but for the first time Jacob felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The darkness still surrounded them, but they had made it through, and in that moment it seemed as if anything was possible. They moved toward the safety of the night, toward a future that was still uncertain, but for now at least, they were alive. Together.